Energy and metabolism. So let's start with an energy recap. All cells require energy in order to survive. We have chemoheterotrophs, and chemoheterotrophs survive by obtaining energy and carbon by consuming organic molecules. So they actually have to eat their food. Then we have photoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs harness light energy. Photo is the root that means light. They harness that light energy to power the synthesis or the making of organic compounds from carbon dioxide. So they use light and carbon dioxide, and they synthesize organic compounds like glucose and other sugars using photosynthesis. It's cool that the inputs of one of these processes are the outputs of the other. If we take a look right here, we have our chloroplasts, and photosynthesis happens in our chloroplasts. So we have light energy that enters our ecosystem. Our chloroplasts capture that light energy and convert it into organic molecules and oxygen gas. Then our mitochondrion, through cell respiration, takes those organic molecules and, in the presence of oxygen, and breaks those down into carbon dioxide and water. And it also releases energy as it's breaking down those organic molecules. That process is called cell respiration. And so we're releasing ATP or energy through cell respiration, and that powers most cellular work. So things like active transport require an input of energy, and some of that energy is also lost as heat energy. Heat energy usually cannot be put to work. And so since the inputs of one are the outputs of the other, that explains why the equation for aerobic cell respiration and photosynthesis are flipped. So the equation for aerobic cell respiration is C6H12O6, that's our glucose, plus 6 oxygen, 6 O2, yields 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O. So glucose plus 6 molecular oxygens yields 6 carbon dioxide and 6 waters. Now for photosynthesis, we flip the ingredients in the products, the reactants in the products. So for photosynthesis, we take in 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water molecules, and we yield 1 glucose molecule and 6 molecular oxygen molecules. Now, it's interesting that the energy stored in the bonds of organic molecules, so the energy stored in this glucose, okay, the glucose or organic molecules that are made during photosynthesis, they store energy, okay, and that energy is stored until that food is broken down. And all that energy ultimately comes from the sun. Alright, I like to eat, lots of people like to eat. Not only does food taste good, but food gives us energy. Food or organic compounds store energy in their arrangement of atoms. So the reason that food gives us energy is that it has lots of chemical bonds between those atoms, and those chemical bonds store energy. When we break those bonds, they release energy that our body can use to power cell activities. When we eat complex organic molecules, aka food, enzymes degrade them or break them down into simpler products. This is a catabolic reaction, and it releases energy that was once stored in the bonds. This energy can be harvested and used to do work. Some energy is also released as heat. So here are our complex organic molecules, our food, and there's bonds that are connecting those molecules together. Energy is stored inside of those bonds. Now, when we break those bonds apart, we release energy, so we have smaller molecules and energy, or simpler molecules and energy. Now, let's talk about our energy waterfall of electrons. So, the relocation of electrons, and we're going to abbreviate electrons as E to the negative from now on. So, the relocation of electrons from one reactant to another releases energy. So, we release energy when we move electrons from one atom to another. An electron loses potential energy when it shifts from a less electronegative atom, so a less greedy atom, towards a more electronegative one. So an electron loses energy as it's moving towards an atom that's more electron greedy, so more electronegative. And this works kind of like a ball loses potential energy when it rolls downhill. Hydrogen atoms are said to carry hilltop electrons, or very electrons that are full of potential energy, since hydrogen is not very electronegative at all. So atoms that are not very electronegative, and they're holding electrons, they store a lot of potential energy in those electrons. And when those electrons move to an atom that's more electronegative, energy is released. As hydrogen atoms are transferred from an organic molecule to oxygen, and oxygen is a very electronegative atom, So as hydrogen atoms are moved from an organic molecule to this very electronegative oxygen, energy is released, which can be used to make ATP. So our electrons that are attached to not very electronegative atoms contain a lot of potential energy, okay, a lot of free energy. Now when we transfer those electrons to other atoms, okay, that are more and more increasingly electronegative, we release energy as we transfer them. And I have oxygen at the bottom because it's the most electronegative, and we are losing potential energy with these electrons as we're moving to more electronegative atoms. Now let's discuss the control of metabolism. So metabolic reactions are very tightly controlled in multi-step metabolic pathways. The reaction of hydrogen with oxygen, so we're moving our electrons from an atom of hydrogen and moving those electrons to oxygen, which is very electronegative, that releases a ton of energy because a hydrogen atom, or just the hydrogen, is not electronegative at all. And then oxygen is extremely electronegative. So we're going from a lot of potential energy to a very little potential energy. So we'd be losing a lot of energy. If we do that all at once, it would result in an explosive release of heat and light energy. So when we mix oxygen, molecular oxygen, and hydrogen together, we would get an explosion. So instead of our cells doing that, hydrogen atoms are shuttled to increasingly electronegative molecules, and finally ending up at oxygen, resulting in a controlled release of energy. So just like we saw in the previous slide, we're not moving our electrons directly from hydrogen to our oxygen. We're shuttling them from one molecule to another. So we release a little bit of energy at each step. So these electron shuttle molecules are referred to as the electron transport chain. And you're going to learn more about the electron transport chain in the video on aerobic cellular respiration. Now let's discuss redox reactions. Redox reactions should be a review from chemistry. If not, pay close attention to this slide right here. If you'll remember, redox is a chemical reaction where electrons are transferred from one atom to another. So whenever we're discussing redox reactions, we're moving electrons from one atom to another atom. So one atom is losing the electrons and the other atom is gaining electrons. So when we are losing electrons from a substance, we call that oxidation. So if we have an atom that's losing electrons, it's been oxidized. And you can remember that by oil. Oxidation is losing electrons. And then reduction is the addition of electrons to a substance. So if we have an atom that's gaining electrons, it's been reduced. So we can remember that by rig. Reduction is gaining electrons. So remember that by oil rig. Oxidation is losing, reduction is gaining. So let's look at an example. We have sodium and chloride. When we react sodium and chloride, the sodium loses an electron. Okay? So it's losing an electron, so it's becoming oxidized. So since it's losing an electron, it's losing negative charge, it becomes positively charged. And then our chloride ion, or chloride, is going to gain that electron, so it becomes negatively charged. Since it's gaining an electron, remember our oil rig, it becomes reduced. Okay, so its charge is reduced, it becomes negative. Another example, we have methane and molecular oxygen, and we're making carbon dioxide and water. So this carbon is losing electrons that are being carried along with hydrogen. Something that's important to note is electrons travel with hydrogen atoms when we're talking about electrons moving in reactions in a cell. So this is our carbon, and it has these 4 hydrogen atoms. So it's being oxidized. It's losing those hydrogens. It's losing those electrons. Okay, so it's being oxidized. And then this oxygen atom is going to gain the hydrogens that used to be bound to the carbon. So it's, along with those hydrogens, it's gaining electrons. Okay? So our oxygen gains electrons, so it's being reduced. Okay? And we're forming carbon dioxide and water. Finally, let's discuss our electron shuttles a little bit more. Instead of direct transfer of electrons from glucose to oxygen, so instead of moving our electrons directly from those bonds of high potential energy, moving them to our very electronegative oxygen, if we did that all at once, that would result in an explosion. Okay, it would release a lot of energy, but we couldn't capture a lot of that energy and actually do work with it. So instead of a direct transfer of electrons from glucose to oxygen, cells decouple or break apart metabolic oxidation and reduction, so there is a controlled release of energy. So we do stepwise reactions. We move it from a little bit more electronegative atom to a little bit more electronegative atom to a little bit more electronegative atom until we eventually end up at oxygen. And then we're releasing a little bit of energy at each step. So electron shuttles are compounds that store electrons from food. And remember, your food is any molecule that has a lot of carbon-hydrogen bonds, okay? And our electrons are carried in those hydrogens. So electron shuttles can exist in either oxidized forms or reduced forms. So our oxidized forms would be when they don't have the electron bound to it, and our reduced forms would be when they have that our other electron added. So X represents the atom without the electron or the hydrogen, and then XH represents the atom with that hydrogen and the electron bound to it. So remember, electrons travel with our hydrogen atoms. We have two major electron shuttles in the electron transport chain. So we have nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, and you don't have to know that long name. You could just abbreviate it as NAD, okay? And then that's the oxidized form. It doesn't have electrons bound to it, or extra electrons bound. And then we add electrons, or gaining electrons, we call that NADH. That's our reduced form. Okay, and then our other major electron shuttle is flavin adenine dinucleotide. Okay, and we'll just abbreviate that as FAD, and then it can carry 2 electrons, so it's FAD-H2. Okay, so NADH only carries 1 electron, and then FAD-H2 can carry 2. All right, so that's it for our introduction to metabolism.